David. The giant killer. No fear here. Up amongst the hills, perched like the nest of a bird on one of the long low ridges, lies the little town of Bethlehem. It was but a small town at the time this story begins, and there was nothing about it to make it at all famous. It lay out of the beaten track, and anyone wanting to visit it must climb the long winding road that led from the plain beneath, through olive groves and sheep fields, up to the city gate, a steep, difficult road, leading nowhere but to the little town itself. It was in these fields on the slope of the hills that David, the shepherd boy of Bethlehem, spent his days watching his father's flocks. That father, whose name was Jesse, was one of the chief men of the town, and David was the youngest of all his sons. There were 7 big brothers at home, and it was no wonder Jesse was proud of his sons. They were tall, splendid young men, all of them doing men's work now, and taking very little notice of the youngest, who was still only a small boy, chiefly useful in looking after the sheep. But though David was but little thought of, no one could say that he did not do his work well. There was not a more careful or watchful shepherd on all the hills around Bethlehem. He knew each one of his sheep, and never allowed one to stray. He always led them to the best pasture, and found the coolest and freshest water for them to drink. Then, too, he was as brave as a lion, and if any wild beast came lurking round hoping to snatch a lamb away, David was up at once and would attack the fiercest beast single-handed. Nothing could ever do any harm to his flock. Bethlehem, located in the mountainous landscape, a town that closely looks like a peaceful bird sanctuary perched atop a ridge, was initially accessible only by a winding road slicing through rich olive groves and grassy sheep pastures. Here, David, the youngest son of the respected minister Jesse, engaged in his duties, tending to his flock surrounded by the hills. Often overshadowed by his 7 older brothers, despite being frequently overlooked due to his youth and inexperience, David exhibited remarkable diligence and bravery, devotedly shielding his flock from any impending dangers. Ignored by many, an important moment was about to unfold as the venerated prophet Samuel ventured into Bethlehem on a confidential heavenly mission. This mission, to anoint a successor to the throne from among Jesse's lineage. Samuel's encounter with Jesse's sons yielded no suitable candidate, until David, who had been in the fields, was brought forth. In the middle of some astonishment from the townspeople, David, whose heart purred with a profound divine call, was anointed as the king-to-be. Not discouraged by the townspeople's skepticism, David further sharpened his skills as a shepherd, musician, and skilled marksman, quietly shaping himself for the monumental future that lay ahead. Beyond just juggling, David was able to tap into the power of musical harmony and pinpoint accuracy. He had an inborn feeling of a greater mission, a purpose that was creatively related to heavenly plans. Consistent with this insight was God's unexpected call, which came to pass more quickly than he had expected. An evil spirit plagued the chosen people, causing King Saul great distress and mental anguish. As a last resort, his counselors suggested the calming effects of music to help him cope with his pain. David, whose skill and bravery were already well known in the community, was found during their quest for a master harpist. In other words, the musical artistry and delicate fingerwork of David the harpist began to fill the king's apartments with a heavenly calmness, and his tunes did wonders to all, as well as King Saul. For some reason, listening to these melodies lifted Saul out of his dark thoughts and into peaceful imagery of the lush fields and winding rivers that made up his kingdom. Aside from his musical talents, David's unwavering faith and bravery also struck a chord with the Almighty, and they were instrumental in driving the oppressive spirits away. In other words, at first, Saul had taken a fancy to David for his personal armor-bearer because of his luminous countenance and dreadlocks. But when David's musical duties ended, he went back to his life as a shepherd in Bethlehem. Yet a more ambitious plan were being set up by fate. When hostilities broke out with the Philistines, the need for precise and fearless fighters became clear. When David's father, Jesse, sent him to the battlefield, his older brothers were already fighting for Saul. As David came near the disputed valley, he could feel the tension building for an impending battle. He hurried to find his brothers in the middle of the camp, using his experience as Saul's assistant to get about quickly. When they reunited, he wanted to know how they were doing and what was going on, but a flurry of activity cut him off. A gigantic enemy named Goliath emerged from the Philistines' camp, and his cries resounded throughout the battlefield like a black cloud clashing with the sun. In spite of the obvious hostility and the king's extravagant promises of reward, not a single warrior dared to confront Goliath's disrespectful rejection of Israel's God. Determination replaced David's shock at the group's apparent lack of courage. In the face of his brother's cold rejection, David maintained a composed expression and dogged determination. King Saul was reminded of the young harpist who had once soothed his pain when word got around that he was prepared to face Goliath. In other words, David, summoned back into Saul's presence, stood a changed man, prepared to reveal his destiny. He showed that even the most modest talents, when combined with bravery and faith, can lead to great success and salvation. King Saul failed to recognize David at first glance because of his young age and little stature. The idea of a young child as skinny as David taking on the enormous Goliath was ridiculous to Saul. He voiced his disapproval, saying that David shouldn't have fought the Philistine in such a massive battle because he was too young and had no combat experience. As he spoke with unflinching knowledge, David recalled a time when he bravely protected his father's sheep from wild animals, even overpowering a lion and a bear on his own. Instead of crediting his own strength, he said that the victories were due to the Lord's heaven-sent assistance. In other words, after witnessing David's extraordinary courage and unwavering faith, Saul's outlook changed. He gave David his blessing, approving of his struggle because he knew the Lord would be with him. David resorted to his trusty sling, put on his shepherd's attire, gathered stones for his pouch, and confronted the terrifying Goliath with unfaltering resolve, even though Saul offered him his royal armor and sword. When Goliath saw that David was carrying only his sling, he became enraged. But David boldly said that he had come in the Lord's name and that the victory had been won by the Lord. David deftly hurled a stone at Goliath, knocking the monster to the ground. David took advantage of the giant's collapse and killed him with Goliath's sword, giving his people a crucial victory. After this, Saul made David a captain in his army. After that, David proudly served his king and nation as a fierce warrior, shifting from his previous role as a shepherd. Faith in God remained unshaken in David's heart despite the many trials he endured. As predicted by Samuel, he eventually became king and took his place on the throne. From his meager origins as a shepherd all the way to his reign as king, David willingly accepted the guiding hand of God. While he never denied his shortcomings, he did ask God for forgiveness time and time again. Similar to his unwavering commitment to his flock, David was willing to lay down his life for the sake of his people. From shepherd to king, this biography of David shows David's story shows the power of faith and God's grace. His journey from shepherd to king is a testament to God's love and mercy. David's unwavering faith and bravery in facing Goliath demonstrated that true power comes from trusting in God. Saul learned from David's example that faith, not physical strength, is the key to overcoming challenges. David's story inspires us all to believe that even the smallest and weakest can achieve greatness through faith in God. Remember, be a David, not a Saul. Peace. Have a blessed day.